who's familiar with the Bible, when exactly the church was born, they'd almost certainly give you the exact same answer.
Oh, absolutely. They'd point straight to the New Testament.
Right. They'd point to the book of Acts, specifically to that really dramatic day of Pentecost. The rushing wind, tongues of fire, Peter giving that massive sermon.
Yeah, Pentecost has basically been celebrated as the undisputed birthday of the church for, 2,000 years?
Exactly. But, and this is why we're doing this deep dive today, what if you were to find out that the actual founding documents of the faith, completely disagree with that timeline?
It's a massive historical blind spot, really.
Huh.
When you actually strip away all the centuries of modern tradition and just look at the raw text, that clean, familiar timeline we all know just shatters.
It really does. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating, honestly highly disruptive stack of study documents compiled by an author named George Gilbert Marin.
And his approach is what makes this so compelling. He relies heavily on this thing called the Berean method.
Right, which is a term pulled straight out of Acts chapter 17.
Yeah, the Bereans were this group of ancient people who were famous for having a really healthy skepticism. When the Apostle Paul showed up in their town teaching these radical new ideas, they didn't just blindly accept it.
But they didn't reject it outright either, right?
Exactly. The text actually says they examined the ancient scriptures daily to see if what Paul was saying was true. They wanted to look at the source code for themselves.
And that is exactly our mission today. We aren't here to push a specific denomination or tell you what you should believe. If you're listening right now, just consider us your research assistants.
We're putting on our historical detective hats.
Yes. We're just going to look purely at the raw source code of the Old and New Testaments and trace these linguistic breadcrumbs.
And the core premise of Marin's research here is going to challenge you to completely rethink the timeline of biblical history. He's arguing that the church did not start in the New Testament at all. It is far older.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the study challenges you to stop seeing the Bible as two disconnected halves. The Old Testament as some obsolete prologue and the New Testament as the real story.
Right. It asks you to see it as one continuous, unbroken story.
But to understand how we got this so backwards in our modern thinking, we actually have to start with a trap. A linguistic trap.
Yeah, the etymology trap.
Exactly. Because when you, or really any English speaker, hears the word church, your brain immediately conjures up a very specific image.
Right. You think of a physical building.
Yeah.
Stained glass, a steeple, pews.
Or, maybe you think of an institution, like a nonprofit with a board of directors, a denominational headquarters, tax-exempt status, all that stuff.
But literally none of those concepts existed in the first century.
Right, so to figure out what the New Testament authors actually meant, these sources dive into the original Greek word they wrote down, which is ekklesia.
And the linguistic history of ecclesia is, well, it's the key that unlocks this entire study.
Break that down for us.
Sure, so the New Testament writers lived in a Greco-Roman world, right? They wrote in Greek. And ecclesia is a compound word. It comes from the preposition ek, which means out of,
Okay.
and the verb kaleo, which means to call. So literally, translated directly, ecclesia means the called out ones.
But here's a crazy part. In the ancient world, before Jesus and the apostles, this wasn't a religious word at all.
Not even a little bit.
If you lived in ancient Athens, say 400 years before the New Testament was written, the ecclesia was just your civic assembly.
Right, it was just a town hall meeting.
Yeah, a town crier would literally blow a horn, and the citizens were called out of their private homes to gather in the public square to vote on stuff, declaring war, electing officials, whatever.
It was an entirely secular term for a group of people summoned by an authority for a specific purpose.
So why would the early followers of Jesus grab a secular Greek civic term to describe their deeply Jewish spiritual movement? Why not use a word that meant religious club or something?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the apostles didn't just pull this word out of the thin air of Greek culture. They pulled it from a much older, much more authoritative source.
The Septuagint.
Exactly. The Septuagint changes absolutely everything about how you read the New Testament.
So for the listener who might not be super familiar, what is the Septuagint?
So after Alexander the Great conquered the known world, everywhere became Hellenized. Greek became the common language for everything: commerce, politics, daily life.
Right.
And because of this, many Jewish communities, especially outside of Judea, like in Alexandria and Egypt, they started losing their fluency in ancient Hebrew.
It's like a third-generation immigrant family today, right? The kids grow up speaking English and eventually can't read their grandparents' native language.
That's a perfect analogy. You had entire generations of Jewish kids who couldn't read the scrolls of Moses. So a couple of hundred years before Jesus, there was this massive translation project. Jewish scholars translated the entire Hebrew Old Testament into Greek.
And that translation is the Septuagint.
Right, and it became the dominant Bible of the first century. When Jesus or Paul are quoting the Old Testament in the Gospels and Epistles, they are usually quoting the Septuagint.
And this is where that linguistic trap gets sprung in Marine's notes, because when those ancient scholars were translating their Hebrew scrolls, they kept hitting this really important Hebrew word, kahal.
Yes, kahal is massive. It basically means the formal assembly or congregation of God's people.
It was the word used when Israel was summoned to hear the law or enter a covenant.
Exactly. It wasn't just a random crowd. It was the covenantal gathering of the Israelites.
So the translators have this weighty Hebrew word, kahal, and they need a Greek equivalent. And what do they choose?
They choose ecclesia.
Over 70 times.
Over 70 times in the Greek Old Testament, kahal is translated as ecclesia. Look at Deuteronomy 9. Moses talks about the day of the assembly at Sinai. In the Greek, that's the day of the ecclesia.
Or Psalm 22, right? The Messianic Psalm. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. In the Greek Bible that the apostles actually used, David is saying, in the midst of the ecclesia, I will praise you. Wait, okay, so if I'm playing devil's advocate here, or pushing back on behalf of the listener.
Sure, go for it.
If we just swap the words, does that mean every time a town gathered in ancient times, it was a church? Like, think about the word team. A team can be, a group of horses pulling a wagon, or it can be a group of developers building a software app. It's the exact same word, but the context dictates what it actually means. Are we just playing word games with ecclesia?
That is a completely fair pushback, and the sources actually anticipate it. The context is everything. The New Testament writers weren't using ecclesia in its secular Athenian sense.
Right, they weren't calling a town hall meeting.
No. And they weren't talking about a random mob.
Yeah.
I mean, in Acts 19, a literal riot is referred to as an ecclesia just because it was a gathering.
Right.
But when the apostles apply the word to themselves, to their own gatherings, they are explicitly using it in its Septuagint Old Testament context.
They are claiming a title.
Exactly. They are claiming the ancient theological title of the Israelites. They were saying, we are the continuation of the kahal. We are the called out assembly of the God of Abraham.
The word already had thousands of years of theological baggage before Pentecost even happened.
Completely. Which brings us to a moment in the text that, honestly, is the biggest plot twist of this whole study.
Yeah, this blew my mind. If the word ecclesia was already deeply embedded in the Old Testament, where exactly does the Bible first place this so-called church?
It's not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
No, it's in Acts chapter 7. Fact number 2 from the sources, verse 38.
And you have to look at the context of Acts 7. This is Stephen's speech.
Right. He's standing before the Sanhedrin, the supreme religious council. He's on trial for his life, accused of blasphemy.
And instead of defending himself, he goes on the offensive with this sweeping historical recap of Israel, Abraham, Joseph, Moses.
And right in the middle of it, Stephen is talking about the Israelites who had just crossed the Red Sea and were standing at Mount Sinai. And according to the Greek text of Acts 7.38, Stephen says, "This is he who was in the ecclesia in the wilderness."
He literally calls the ancient Israelites wandering in the desert the church.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Just think about the irony of that. Modern readers look at Acts 2 for the birth of the church, but just 5 chapters later, Acts 7 explicitly points backwards, over the 1,000 years backwards, to the desert of Sinai.
It completely reorients your understanding. Imagine reading a history book that suddenly reveals the founding fathers of a country actually lived 1,000 years earlier than everyone thought.
It totally shorts out the conventional timeline. The New Testament itself refuses to let you sever the early Christians from the ancient Israelites.
But this timeline shift creates an immediate problem that the sources have to deal with.
Right, the elephant in the room. If the church was already out there in the desert at Sinai, what do we do with Passover? And more importantly, what actually happened at Pentecost?
Right. If Pentecost wasn't a birthday party, what was it?
So the study spends a lot of time comparing these 3 massive biblical events: Passover, Sinai, and Pentecost. Let's walk through them chronologically.
Let's start with Passover in Exodus 12. The Israelites are slaves in Egypt. God sends the plagues. They sacrifice the spotless lamb, put the blood on the doorposts, and they were saved from the judgment.
It's the ultimate moment of rescue and liberation. And obviously, the New Testament ties this directly to Jesus. Paul calls Jesus our Passover lamb.
But Marine makes a crucial distinction here regarding the formation of the church. Passover is redemption. It liberates a people, it gets them out of slavery, but it doesn't organize them.
They are just a massive crowd of fleeing refugees at that point.
Exactly. They aren't a nation yet. They don't have a constitution or a formal covenant.
Which takes us to 50 days later, the second pivotal moment. Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, they arrive at the base of the mountain.
And this is where the study plants the flag for the actual birth of the ecclesia. God gathers them and proposes a formal covenant. He says, if you obey my voice, you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
It's essentially a marriage proposal.
Yes. Passover was the rescue. Sinai is the wedding ceremony. God gives them the law, the Torah, which is essentially their constitution. They are officially formed into the Kahal, the called out assembly.
Okay, so if Sinai is the birth of the church, what in the world happened in Acts chapter 2? What was Pentecost?
To understand Pentecost, you have to look at the Jewish calendar. Pentecost didn't just happen on a random Tuesday.
Right, it was Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks.
Exactly. Pentecost just means 50th in Greek. It was celebrated 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits.
And Shavuot was originally an agricultural festival, right? Like the wheat harvest.
Originally, yes. But over the centuries, it became recognized in Jewish tradition as the exact anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai.
Wait, really? The exact anniversary?
Yes. The math lines up perfectly with the Exodus timeline.
Wow. So the day the Holy Spirit falls on the disciples in Acts 2 is the exact anniversary of the day the law was given at Mount Sinai. That is just incredible mathematical poetry.
And the sources draw out these astonishing sensory parallels between the two events. Just look at the descriptions.
Yeah, at Sinai in Exodus 19, you have fire, smoke, the mountain violently shaking, and the blast of a loud trumpet. God's presence shows up with fire and sound.
And then look at Acts 2. The disciples are in the upper room. Suddenly there is the sound of a mighty rushing wind, and what appears?
Tongues of fire.
Fire and sound. It's the exact same divine signature.
And it goes even deeper, doesn't it, with the languages?
Yes, there's an ancient Jewish tradition, a midrash, that says when God spoke at Sinai, his voice divided into 70 languages, tons of fire, so every nation could hear the law.
And in Acts 2, they stumble out into the streets speaking in tongues, and all the pilgrims from all over the known world hear the wonders of God in their own native languages. It's a deliberate reenactment.
But not just a reenactment, it's a fulfillment.
Right, of Jeremiah.
Exactly. Jeremiah 31.33. Hundreds of years earlier, God prophesied, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts.
Because at Sinai, the law was written on stone tablets. It was external, they had the rules, but they didn't have the internal ability to actually keep them. The Old Testament is basically them failing to keep it.
Right. Their hearts were hard. So at Pentecost, the Spirit comes down and internalizes the relationship. The law is finally written on the heart.
Okay, let me throw an analogy at you for the listener.
Let's hear it.
If Sinai is the moment you build a brand new smartphone, you put the hardware together, you install the first operating system, that's the birth of the phone, it exists, but over time the operating system keeps crashing. It can't handle the tasks. So Pentecost isn't the invention of a totally new phone. You don't throw the hardware away. Pentecost is a massive, revolutionary software update.
I love that.
It's an over-the-air OS upgrade that suddenly empowers the exact same phone to do things it couldn't do before. The hardware, the assembly didn't change, just the internal programming.
That is a brilliant synthesis of what Marin is arguing. Pentecost was the empowerment and maturity of the church. It was not its creation.
It was an upgrade.
Yes. The Spirit equipped an already existing assembly to actually live out the calling they received a millennium earlier.
But if we say Pentecost is just an upgrade, we have to deal with Jesus and the Gospels, specifically Matthew 16.
Yes. Upon this rock I will build my church.
Right. Jesus uses the future tense, I will build. Doesn't that explicitly mean he is starting from scratch, like building a new religion?
It's the most common counterargument. But the sources tackle this by looking at the Greek word for build used there, which is oikodomi.
Okay, what does oikodomi mean?
It means to build upon a foundation that already exists. To restore, to strengthen, or to complete a structure. It does not mean to create out of nothing.
Oh, wow. So he's saying, I will restore my church.
Exactly. Jesus isn't acting as a developer building a new subdivision. He is the master carpenter restoring a historic, dilapidated house. He's taking the assembly that began at Sinai, which has been fractured and corrupted, and he's rebuilding it.
And we know that was his mindset because of what he says in Matthew 15. The sources point out verse 24, where Jesus literally says, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
If he was starting a new Gentile religion, that statement makes absolutely zero sense.
Right. Why would he restrict his entire earthly ministry to Jewish crowds if his goal was a new universal religion?
It only makes sense if his mission was the restoration of the Kahal, the existing assembly.
And honestly, the church was already highly active during the Gospels well before Pentecost. Jesus called 12 apostles. That's a direct parallel to the 12 tribes of Israel.
He's reconstituting the leadership.
Exactly. And in Matthew 18, he gives them rules for congregational discipline. Tell it to the church. You can't tell it to the church if the church doesn't exist yet.
And in Luke 10, he sends out the 72 to preach and heal. The infrastructure is already mobilized.
This raises an important question. If Jesus is reforming Israel and not starting a new religion, then the New Testament isn't a break from the Old Testament.
No, it's not Plan B at all. It is the climactic chapter of the exact same story.
And if that's true, the Old Testament prophets must have seen it coming, which the sources say they absolutely did.
They did. You look at Ezekiel's valley of dry bones, God promising to put breath back into the scattered house of Israel. You look at Joel promising the Spirit poured out, Isaiah and Micah seeing all nations eventually streaming to the God of Israel.
But the real smoking gun here is the concept of the new covenant itself.
Yes, Jeremiah 31.31.
We throw the phrase New Testament around all the time, but it's an Old Testament prophecy, and the specific wording of it is mind-blowing when you look closely.
Walk us through it.
Okay, so Israel at that time had split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Both went into rebellion and exile.
The house was in ruins.
Total ruins. But God speaks through Jeremiah and says, Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.
The parameters of that contract are incredibly specific.
Wait, yeah, let's emphasize this. It explicitly says Israel and Judah. It does not say, I will make a new covenant with the Gentiles, or with a brand new entity called the church.
It was promised exclusively to the physical descendants of Abraham, which, as Marin points out, creates a massive theological puzzle for the early believers.
Right, because suddenly in the book of Acts, you have non-Jewish people, Gentiles, believing in Jesus and receiving the Holy Spirit.
So the debate in the early church was, how do Gentiles legally fit into a covenant that wasn't addressed to them?
If the VIP list only says Israel and Judah, how does a Roman soldier get past the bouncer?
There is only one logical answer. They have to be brought into Israel.
Which perfectly transitions us into how the Apostle Paul solves this puzzle. And the sources use Paul to basically dismantle two very popular modern theological frameworks.
Yeah, replacement theology and dispensationalism.
Let's define those quickly. Replacement theology basically claims that because national Israel rejected Jesus, God fired them and completely replaced them with the Gentile church.
Which contradicts God's unconditional promises in the Old Testament.
Right. And dispensationalism claims God has two totally separate plans, an earthly one for Israel and a heavenly one for the church. They never mix.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Paul argues that both of those frameworks are wrong. He argues for total continuity.
The olive tree analogy in Romans 11.
Yes, Paul says there's only one tree. The root system is the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The natural branches are physical Israel.
But some of those natural branches were broken off because of unbelief.
Right, and then Paul looks at the Gentiles and calls them wild olive shoots. And he says God took those wild branches and grafted them into the exact same ancient tree right alongside the remaining natural branches.
Why? So they could share the nourishing sap of the ancient root system.
Notice, Paul doesn't say God chopped down the olive tree and planted a brand new apple tree called the church.
Right. And there aren't two trees growing in the yard either. There's just one tree.
And Paul confirms this identity shift in Ephesians 2. He tells the Gentiles, you used to be aliens to the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants. But now, through Christ, you are fellow citizens.
It's just like immigrating to a new country. You don't start a rival nation in your backyard. You go through a legal process to become a citizen of the existing nation. And once you do, you share its history, its laws, and its future. You're grafted in.
And Galatians 3.29 cements it. If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed.
That is profound. If you're listening to this and you're not of Jewish descent, your biblical identity, according to these texts, is a spiritual Israelite. not part of some separated Gentile religion. There was only one people of God.
And if we look at the very end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, this concept is set in stone forever.
Yeah, the architecture of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21, John sees the holy city coming down from heaven.
And the visual layout perfectly synthesizes everything we've talked about. The city has a massive wall with 12 gates.
And the gates are named after the 12 tribes of Israel, the Old Covenant.
But the wall also has 12 foundations holding it up. And the foundations are named after the 12 apostles of the Lamb, the New Covenant.
You literally cannot separate them. You can't enter the eternal city of the New Covenant without walking through the gates of ancient Israel.
There aren't two cities. There aren't two temples. There's one city, one Lamb, and one unified people.
It perfectly mirrors the continuity. Okay, so we've laid out this massive, bulletproof timeline from the sources, but we have to ask, so what?
All right, why does this matter practically?
Why did Marin write this? Why does it matter if the church started at Sinai instead of Pentecost?
It all comes down to authority. If the church started in Acts 2, then it's a startup. Jesus founded a new institution. Peter was the first leader.
And later organizations can trace their lineage back to that startup and claim to be the original founders.
Exactly. They can claim they hold the original charter, so they have authority over the scriptures and over the believers.
But if the church has existed since Moses in the desert,
then no modern human institution can claim to have started it. The authority is entirely stripped from human tradition and returned strictly to the Word of God.
that completely changes how you read the Bible. It's no longer a disjointed two-part series where the first part got canceled. It's one single story of God gathering a people from Abraham all the way to the apocalypse.
And that's the whole point of this deep dive. To help you see the unbroken architecture of the texts and invite you to embrace that Berean mindset.
Look at the source code for yourself. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If the church isn't a building or a new religion, but this continuous ancient assembly spanning thousands of years, how does that change the way you view the person sitting next to you?
It changes everything.
How does it change your role in a story that started long before the New Testament was even written? What if the history of ancient Israel isn't just an old story, but through being grafted in, it's actually your family history? Keep asking the big questions. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.